Thank you, everyone. Happy Monday morning. Thank you for taking some time out of your Monday morning to join us on this webinar. This is our latest one, Best Legal Practices in Owning and Operating Rental Property. This one is on how to list, sell, and close a tenanted property during COVID-19. This is very relevant to your business because not only are landlords and tenants affected by COVID, but realtors are, and it is a challenge as you've been experiencing in your business in trying to list, sell, get the tenant to cooperate, and close the property during a pandemic. So we're going to talk a little bit about obviously the topic, and then we'll hold off questions until the very end. We can do a Q&A, and you can ask me anything that's landlord and tenant related. For those of you who don't know me, my past lies in real estate. If you already haven't done so, head over to our social media, like us and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. I always tend to either give away free downloads or to update you with what's going on in the landlord and tenancy realm. If you ever have any questions, or if you come across a matter that you're not sure how to handle, I'm very responsive. So give me a call or send me an email, and I'd be more than happy to help you as best as I can. So for the purpose of this presentation, everything we discuss is for information only. And if you have any questions, or if you want to discuss a matter, you can wait until the Q&A at the very end. Or if it is a private matter, give me a call and I'd be more than happy to help you as much as I can. So we're going to start off the presentation. We're going to talk a little bit about the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal. And the reason why I want to talk a little bit about human rights, you're probably thinking, what does human rights have to do with tenancies? Well, we're going to take a little step back because we're going to talk a little bit about discriminatory advertising and discriminating when it comes to picking and choosing tenants. So that's why we're going to start off and we're going to talk about refusal to rent, the Ontario Human Rights Code. So when I refer to housing providers, I'm referring to the smaller landlord, not the multi-million dollar corporation, but more so the mom and pop landlord, or the individual who's bought a condo and is renting it out for an investment. So many housing providers, particularly smaller landlords, may be renting out either a portion of their home or the secondary property. They're often under false impressions that they may actually pick and choose tenants in whatever way they see fit. However, this is what you have to keep in mind. The Ontario Human Rights Code applies to all rental housing arrangements in Ontario. Okay, it doesn't just apply to one or two properties or just apartment buildings, but all properties that are being used as a rental property. Therefore, once a housing provider decides to offer a rental property to the public for rent, they must do so in a non-discriminatory way, which means that whenever you put an ad out, you cannot pick and choose who you want to rent out the property to. And the reason for that is because a landlord who denies a rental opportunity to a person because of whatever that person's characteristic is that's identified by the code, you're actually opening yourself up to a human rights violation or a claim. So a refusal to rent most commonly takes place in the form of discriminatory advertising and discriminatory tenant screening. I'm sure everybody has had that client who doesn't want to rent to someone because of such and such reason, or they don't want to rent to a certain race because of such and such reason. It happens more than you think, and more so it happens on the MLS or on Kijiji, on ads that realtors put out. So when listing rental properties, landlords may not exclude people identified by the Ontario Human Rights Code. For example, when you're putting together an MLS listing for lease, when you're saying things like suits a working person or great for young couples, you're actually indicating that people who receive for example, social assistance, or people who are not able to work due to a disability or any other code ground, they're not they're not, or they should not need not apply. And we want to stay away from discriminatory advertising. So discriminatory or inappropriate advertising can take the place in one of the following. Okay, so when you say in your advertisement, adults only, or adult lifestyle, not suitable for children, suitable for a single person or a couple, working people only, professionals only, no kids. Now we're going to get into a little bit deeper root of discriminatory or inappropriate advertising. Canadian citizens only, or no black men please, or Caucasians only. These are, I mean, like I said, we want to shift away from this type of advertising because it can open you up, and not only you, but the brokerage. It can open you and the brokerage up to human rights claim. So these are some examples of discriminatory advertising. If you look at the top left, that's a Kijiji ad, but the third, I think it's the third description from the bottom where it says, no black men, please, sorry. Or the ad on the right, it says Indian students preferred, Gujarati preferred, or the ad at the bottom, Indians preferred male. Here are some more examples. The top left says for a clean working Caucasian person. The top right says white people unacceptable, sorry. And the bottom again says Indian students 350. Again, for those of you who've never encountered this, it's good that you've never encountered it, but you should be educated about the type of advertising to stay away from, especially because you hold a professional real estate your professional license. So what can realtors ask prospective tenants for when advertising a property for lease? So we're going to talk about the difference between income and employment, but a realtor can ask, what is the income? Number two, if you work and where you work. Number three, how many people will be occupying the rental unit? Number four, are there any pets? Guys, this is the time to ask about pets. It's not a discriminatory question to ask because the landlord has the right to know how many people and if and how many pets are going to be occupying the property. Number five, if the tenant is a smoker or a non-smoker. Number six, permission for a credit check. Number seven, references from their previous landlord. The reason why I say previous landlord is because their current landlord, if for example, they're not paying rent or if they're being evicted, their current landlord will tell you whatever you want to hear to get them out of their property. But their previous landlord will tell you the truth. So it's very important that you get either contact information from the previous landlord or some sort of letter where you can communicate with their previous landlord. And number eight, credit report. I always recommend Equifax, and I always recommend that you not only look at the credit score, you want to look at the credit report in its entirety. So, because keep in mind, not all debt is bad debt. Okay, so you want to analyze the report and the frequency of payments. Now we're going to shift a little. Let's talk about income versus employment because I think a lot of realtors don't really know what the difference is between income and employment. So we're going to talk about that. The landlord is permitted to seek and consider income information from prospective tenants. That is your right as a landlord. Income information encompasses information about the amount, source, steadiness of a potential tenant's income. Employment, keep in mind, is a source of income. And based on the Ontario Human Rights Code against discrimination, landlords may only verify that the prospective tenant has a source of income. Now, this source of income, the landlord can verify that can cover the rent. However, the landlord should not or may not assess or judge that source type. Because keep in mind, a lot of people have other sources of income. For example, if you have a, I don't know, if you have a basement apartment close to a college and you have foreign students, Their source of income could be their parents from overseas that are paying the rent. However, maybe they don't have employment. Does that mean that you should turn them down because they're not working? No, because they have a source of income. So, in other words, landlords are not permitted to discriminate against a prospective tenant because they do not approve of the source of that person's income. So, for example, their employment income, if they're, let's say, for example, if they are an escort, or if they're an entrepreneur, or if they make $30,000 a year, or if they're on ODSP or Ontario Works or on pension, these are all sources of income. So when can employment information be considered? So income information may only be sought and considered if the tenant's credit history and rental history is very minimum. So for example, if you have a newly graduated person from a college who's maybe 20, 21 years old, more than likely they probably have not had very much or very many employment income, but they do have, or they don't have very established credit, but they do have good employment. This is the time that employment can be considered on its face. So if the prospective tenant, when requested, provides very little or no credit history, or very little or no rental history information, then the landlord can consider income information in isolation. Any assessment of all of the available information must be bona fide. And what that means is you have to take it as it is in a non discriminatory manner. So, what can realtors ask prospective tenants for to provide when applying for a property for lease? So, again, you can ask for proof of income. Now you know the difference between income and employment. A credit report from Equifax. Again, I recommend that you look at the credit report history in its entirety and not just focus on the credit score. And number three, reference letter from the previous and or the existing landlord. The previous landlord may be the better option, but it's always good as well to talk to the existing landlord and see why the tenant is moving. So now we've talked a little bit about what you can ask for when you're leasing a property. We're going to shift a little bit to what's going to happen or how we go about selling a property. So these are the three top common questions that realtors ask me on a daily basis before listing a property for sale. So we get an overwhelming number of calls asking, hey, Beta, can we evict a tenant to sell a property? Or the tenant isn't allowing for showings, can we kick them out? Or the landlord's lease is coming to an end, can we give the tenant notice to move out? And the answer to these questions is a hard no. And I'll tell you why. The reason is that tenants have what we call security of tenure. And what that means is that just because their lease is coming to the end of its term doesn't mean the tenancy relationship is over. It means they have a right to carry their tenancy forward on a month to month basis. Okay, so the landlord doesn't call the shots when it comes to termination of tenancy. A tenancy can be terminated only in one of three ways. So, number one, if a tenant decides to leave and gives notice, this is by way of an N9. Number two is the tenant and the landlord agree to terminate tenancy by way of an N11, a mutual agreement to end the tenancy. This is kind of like the mutual release agreement where everybody releases one another from any and all liabilities. Or number three, by way of a court or board order. So just because a lease is coming to the end of its term doesn't mean the landlord can terminate tenancy. Just because the landlord wants to sell the property doesn't mean the tenant has to move out. These are things you have to keep in mind. How do you get a tenant to cooperate with showings? Because right now, this is the challenge that 99% of realtors are having. I always recommend that whenever you're stepping into a scenario where a landlord is selling a property that's tenanted, that you step away from getting involved or getting sucked into the legal drama, I call it. I would highly recommend that you inform your landlord client that they must retain a legal representative, a paralegal who is well versed with the Residential Tenancies Act. Whether it's our firm or somebody else, they have to choose who they're comfortable working with, and they have to choose someone that's going to guide them through the process. This is really, really important. Once that legal representative has been retained, a notice will be sent to the tenant from the legal rep to inform of the sale of the property. Again, proper notice to all tenants must be given for all showings. There cannot be any surprises. Guys, once there is a dent in basically in the process, that tenant will get their back against the wall and they're not going to accommodate for showings. This is why I think it's best for the realtor to just step back and instruct their landlord client to retain a legal rep so that that legal rep can carry the process forward. I'm sure many of you guys have been doing while you're listing properties is providing COVID safety packages to be placed on the property, which include things like hand sanitizers, masks, gloves, shoe or foot booties or coverings. These will provide a peace of mind to that tenant that you do care about their safety. Again, we want to, although all the intention is to sell the property, we have to do so in a safe manner. What's the alternative? So if the tenant doesn't allow for showings, or if the times don't work because the tenant is homeschooling their children, what's the alternative to showing a property and getting it sold without having in-person showings? So something like a video tour has been working quite effectively. And upon an accepted agreement of purchase and sale, with obviously with the condition for a new purchaser to view the property, maybe that'll provide ease as well to the tenant. Again, you want to be courteous to the tenant. Like I mentioned, that one dent in the process will get the tenants to put their back against the wall, and nobody's selling that property. So you want to make sure this is you go about these steps in a diplomatic, in a courteous manner. Oop. So now that you've successfully listed the property, the tenant has cooperated. What happens when a property is sold? Before we move on to the next slide, it's really important that you think about guaranteeing vacant possession. Okay, so the word guaranteeing is a very heavily weighted word. I get many calls from realtors who call me and say, okay, I have a matter for you. I'm going to send them off. We're closing in about 60 days. We need to guarantee vacant possession. Kick out that tenant. Well, I'm going to explain to you the process, but I want you to think about guaranteeing vacant possession. And I'm going to leave you with this before we get into the next slide. There is no way that we can guarantee, or that you can guarantee, or the seller landlord can guarantee vacant possession. Okay, there's no guarantees. However, if the tenant, we're hoping that the tenant is cooperative, once we have a firm agreement of purchase and sale, we put together the N12 form. So this is the notice for the landlord or purchaser's own use. Guys, realtors, as realtors, you hold a professional license. Please do not serve or do not get sucked in and get involved with trying to provide vacant possession. Okay, I'll tell you, it never works out for the realtor in the end. And in the end, they point the finger at you. So, for those of you who've had this experience, you know that when things go wrong, they point the finger at the realtor. So, you want to stay away from this as much as possible. You've done your job, you are hired to sell a property, and you've sold it. Now you have to step back and instruct your client to seek legal advice on how you can go about hopefully providing vacant possession. So the legal representative will do, I'm going to provide you with two options in providing vacant possession. Again, it's not guaranteed, but this has been working quite effectively. So here's the first option is your legal rep would serve an N12 notice to terminate tenancy for the purchaser's own use. On the left side is the first page of the N12. On the right side is the second page of the N12. Anytime I get a call from a realtor who's served this notice, and then I ask them, Have you read the N12? They say, no, it's just filling in the blanks. Well, yeah, I must admit, by looking at it on its face, it looks kind of simple. How do you mess up a landlord's name or a rental address or the termination date or ticking the box of who can move into the property? The problem is, guys, is that you don't know the consequences or the requirements that come with this notice. This is why, even though it looks easy, you don't know the consequences. This is why I'm telling you to stay away from the N12. So now we're going to talk about some of the requirements. So when do you serve the N12? And when I say when do you, when I refer to the word you, I'm saying either the landlord or their legal representative. That's it. No realtor, no property manager, unless the realtor is the landlord or the realtor is the seller. Please stay away from the N12. So this N12 can be served if the landlord's immediate, for the landlord or their immediate family member or caregiver requires the property for their own personal occupation for residential purposes. It's really important that you know it's for residential purposes. That person moving into the rental unit intends to occupy the rental unit for at least 1 year. Okay. Number two, for the purchaser's own use. And for the purpose of this presentation, we're going to be referring it to the N12 for the purchaser's own use. So these are some of the requirements. Again, the landlord has signed a firm agreement of purchase and sale. The property must contain 3 units or less. And the purchaser or purchaser's immediate family member or caregiver requires the property for their personal occupation for residential purposes for at least 1 year. Okay, the N12 cannot be issued if the landlord is a corporation or for members of their extended family. Brother, sister, aunt, uncle cannot serve the N12 for this purpose. Now that we know who's going to be moving into the property, which is a new purchaser, other requirements of the N12 are as follows. The N12, especially the N12, must be served on good faith. So, what is good faith? Good faith is having the genuine intention or intent to occupy the rental property for residential purposes. So, landlords should stay away from serving this N12 notice if their tenant has blocked them from WhatsApp, or they've blocked their phone calls, or they're not answering them, or they're disrespecting them. The N12 is not a loophole that landlords can use to terminate tenancy. Believe me, this is going to backfire on a landlord, because what happens is if the landlord does not have good intentions upon service, a tenant can file a T5 bad faith application against the former landlord within 12 months of the date that they moved out. So the limitation period is 1 year. Okay, it's not 1 week, it's not 30 days, it's 1 year. So you have to make sure that the N12 is served on good faith. Again, realtors cannot serve this notice. So now that we've distinguished the new purchaser requires the property for their own use, how does the landlord or their legal representative serve tenants? So I remember in my early years of getting into the real estate industry in about 2004, we were still using fax machines back then. Well, we were using fax machines back then. My whole point is that the real estate industry has really evolved with technology. This is great because now you guys are using PDF documents, you're using email, you're using DocuServe. Um, Unfortunately, the wheels of justice spin very, very slowly, and email is not an acceptable method of service. DocuSign is not really an acceptable method of signature. Landlords must serve notices to their tenants in accordance with the rules of the Landlord and Tenant Board. They must also fill out what we call a certificate of service and must file this notice with the N12 with the board for a hearing date. So the certificate of service is basically, it's like an affidavit of service. It tells the board who served the notice. So if you're questioning how is the board going to know if the realtor served the notice, well, here it is, through the certificate of service. The landlord may serve their tenants in one of the following ways. So by handing the document to the tenant, by handing it to another adult in the rental unit, by placing it in the tenant's mailbox or where mail is usually delivered, sliding the document under the door or through a mail slot, faxing it to the tenant's residence or place of business, courier, registered mail, or express post. The only thing you have to note is that anytime you use mail, and by mail I'm saying regular mail, registered mail, express post, anytime you use a mail delivery service, you must add 5 days to the date of termination. This is just one of the rules. Again, this is how the board will know that the realtor served the document. So how does the board determine if a notice was served on bad faith? So adjudicators at the landlord and tenant board actually use this three-part test to determine whether or not the N12 was served on bad faith. These are the questions that they ask. So number one, did the tenant rely on the N12 in order to move out of the property? So let's say, for example, a tenant has brought forward an application on bad faith application claiming X amount of monies from the landlord. This is the three-part test that the board will ask you. So did the tenant rely on the N12 to move out of the property? So yes, they relied on that notice to move out. Is there an advertisement of the rental property? So here's when I say you can't really guarantee vacant possession, because even if the purchaser's agent or the cooperating broker puts a clause in the agreement of purchase and sale saying that John Doe is going to be moving into the property and requires vacant possession, if at the day of closing or the day after closing, his circumstances change and he puts the property on the market for a higher rent, this is a breach of bad faith. So is there an advertisement of the rental property? So yes. Did the person who was supposed to move into the unit actually move in? So if the new purchaser is re-renting the place because their circumstances changed, they're not moving in. So that means that tenant or the former tenant had to uproot their life. They had to find another place, usually at a higher rent amount, because they were told or they relied on the N12 notice to move out. Okay, so even if circumstances change, that means that this was a breach of the test of bad faith. So what are remedies that the board can order on a T5 bad faith application to the tenant? So number one, a rent abatement. Number two, difference in rent between the former unit and the new unit. Number three, an order to pay a fine into the board. Number four, moving costs. Number five, any out-of-pocket expenses that the tenant has incurred up to $35,000. And number six, any other order that the board finds appropriate. I'll tell you, these bad faith applications not only will be drafted against the former landlord, so against the former seller landlord, but I'll tell you, I've seen all the realtors be attached to this application. So the cooperating broker, the listing broker, the brokerage, the two brokerages, everyone gets tied into this application. Okay, because that tenant again relied on this notice in order to move out. This is why you want to stay away from serving the N12, because again, not only will you be held liable, is your brokerage will be held liable. Another requirement of the N12 form is compensation. So section 48(1) of the Residential Tenancies Act with respect to compensation states that compensation must be paid by the termination date in the amount of 1 month's rent. Okay, so that you can't get away from. Now, in regards to number two, a declaration or an affidavit to be submitted to the board, I always did this in my practice. So this is nothing new to me. The reason I do it is I like to protect my realtors so that they understand, or the board understands down the road, that if a faith application is drafted against the listing agent or the former seller landlord, that at the time that that we served the N12, we were told or we were following instructions of the cooperating broker. Now, just keep in mind, a lot of cooperating brokers or a lot of realtors are, or just don't know that this N12 or providing vacant possession is heavily rated. And I'll tell you why. They just seem to think that, well, just give notice to the tenant and they'll just leave. Well, it doesn't work that way because, again, that person is uprooting their life. Bill 184 now says that landlords must disclose in the declaration and affidavit any previous notices of termination served to the tenant. So this is where things will come out, that if the landlord has tried to, serve previous N12s to the tenant, now the Bill 184, you have to disclose of any previous notices of termination. This is why, again, guys, don't get involved with these notices. Okay. When my realtors call me and they say, well, the landlord seller served an N12, or I'm sending them your way, or I'm filling out the N12, I'm just going to send it, can you verify something? And I ask them, have you read the N12? And 9 times out of 10 they say, no, I'm just filling in the blanks. Well, it's really important that you read what you're filling out and what you're serving. And I'll tell you why. On the second page of the N12, if you look on the top left, go down three blocks, 1 to 3, it tells the tenant, what if you disagree with the notice? So remember when I was saying, how can you guarantee vacant possession? When in the N12, it says to the tenant, if you disagree with this notice, you do not have to move out. So it's telling the tenant that even if the property is sold, if you don't agree with this notice, you don't have to move out. If the tenant wishes to dispute the notice, or if they feel that the landlord is serving this notice on bad faith, they are not obligated to move out of the rental unit and can remain in the unit until the hearing date. Now, I'll tell you, I've had many sellers say, well, if they remain in the property and they don't provide vacant possession, then once we kick them out, I'm going to go after them. Well, you can't go after them for any damages. You can't go after them for mortgage penalties, for extension of your closing costs. The reason why is that they are exercising their rights as a tenant to remain in the rental unit until a hearing date is set. Okay. If the tenant decides to leave earlier than the termination date, obviously, this is a good problem to have, then the landlord must still refund 1 month extra, must refund their rent, any unused rent amount, and also provide them with 1 month's rent compensation because of the N12 requirement. Okay. So again, please do not serve the N12. It's really, really imperative. I know I sound like a broken record. I'm saying it as we get through the slides, but it's very important that you don't get entangled with this notice. So what happens at the hearing? So the N12, once it's served to the tenant, is filed with the board, obviously for a hearing date. A certificate of service also must be followed. So remember, the certificate of service was basically who served the notice and how it was served and when it was served. It's basically proof of proper service. The landlord or the landlord's legal rep must also provide supporting documentations for the N12. Number one, if you're saying that the new purchaser is moving in, then the agreement of purchase and sale must be provided to the board. If you're saying that a caregiver is moving in, then again, you must provide a doctor's note, or you got to go a little deeper as to a physiotherapy note, or any reason that they, may require a caregiver. Affidavits, declarations, and any other documents requested by the board must be submitted. So what happens if, for example, your deal doesn't close for any reason? Let's say, for example, nothing to do with the tenant. The tenant, let's say, for example, the tenant moved out. We served the N12, the tenant moved out, and then the buyer's financing didn't come through. Does that encompass bad faith? Yes, it does. There's actually no way to cancel an N12. No way, zero way. The landlord must make certain that whoever is moving into the property, whether it's the purchaser, whether it's the landlord, whether it's the purchaser's immediate family member or their caregiver, that person is 100% committed before serving the N12 to the tenant. Because just the excuse of the person changed their mind does not nullify this notice. You have to put yourself into the tenant's shoes, okay? Especially if during a pandemic, If you have kids, if you have young kids, you're uprooting your life, you're trying to find another place. More than likely what you're finding out there is a higher rent, and also find out that that deal did not close and the landlord now changes their mind and they want to re-rent the property. Total bad faith, and you want to stay away from that. So if it's too late to cancel, even if the tenant has signed another lease, compensation must be paid. Okay. You just have to hope that that tenant, the former tenant, does not file an application on bad faith. So by looking at the N12 again, some of you are probably thinking, well, how hard can this be? You're just filling in the blanks. Number one, all legal notices must be free from errors, no matter how minor. So if there's an error in the application, and it happens more than you think, whether it comes to names, initials, dates, address of the rental unit, certificate of service, any minor error, the application will be dismissed and you must start the process all over again. This is again why you want to stay away from it, because guess who they're going to point the finger at if you make an error? So going back to the beginning of this presentation, I said there you can't really guarantee vacant possession, but you do have a couple of options. So the N12 was our first option. Let's talk about current delays at the board, okay, with respect to the N12. Pre-COVID, it took an average time to receive a notice of hearing of about 4 to 5 months, just to receive a notice of hearing. This is why you can't guarantee vacant possession in 60 days. The board closed on March 16 due to COVID. They reopened on August 1st, but they only started holding hearings for non-payment of rent application. Nothing for N12s, nothing for N12 for the purchaser's own use as of yet. Currently, the average amount of time to receive a notice of hearing is about 9 to 12 months. And I'll tell you why. I've just started receiving notices of hearings for applications that I filed back in January. So there is a huge delay. So what's the alternative? So you may be thinking, I may never sell a property and get rid of that tenant. Well, that's not true, because there is another option. Okay, so the alternative is, this is a popular option and I'm sure you guys have heard about it, is the cash for keys. Okay, the cash for keys, guys, again, it's not a DIY. I don't recommend that you get involved with this, because this is a even more heavier weighted than the N12. The cash for keys is exactly what I call it. You're offering cash in exchange for the keys. Obviously, the offer for cash for keys must be an enticing offer. And by enticing, I mean, not 1 month's rent, because 1 month's rent is the N12 requirement. They might as well stay where they are and wait for a hearing date, which more often than not tenants are doing. An enticing offer is just enough for a first and last, and covering a little bit of their moving costs. So anywhere from around 5,000 would be enticing. But I'll tell you, I've had clients who've settled at 20,000, 25,000, 32,000, 64,000, even $70,000, depending on their circumstances. Your legal representative, the licensed paralegal, would obviously facilitate a termination of tenancy with that tenant, meaning that all communications will be made with that tenant. They would negotiate the terms. And again, you have to make sure the legal rep that you use is well versed in their experience of having done cash for keys, because that paralegal would often do a consent agreement as well as the N11. Remember, the N11 we spoke about earlier in the presentation, which was the mutual agreement to end the tenancy. That N11 agreement is even more simpler on its face when you're looking at it than the N12 is, because the only thing that it has is that you have to insert the termination date. That's it. However, the N11 is a very heavily weighted agreement. And I call this the incredible Hulk of the landlord and tenant board agreements. The reason for that is because once it's signed, the intention at the time of signing is to terminate tenancy. So what we do is, once we file it with the board, we request an ex parte order. And for those of you who don't know what an ex parte order is that it's an order to terminate tenancy and evict that tenant if they don't leave by the termination date in the N11 without a hearing. So you are bypassing the 9, 10, 11, 12-month delays at the board in order to wait for a hearing. The timing or the turnaround time to do a cash for keys is often 60 to 90 days to receive an LTB order. Okay, so this goes parallel to your closing date. And obviously, the legal representative would arrange for keys to be picked up. Again, this is the alternative. This has been working quite effectively. You may want to talk to your landlords or sellers about this as an option if the N12 does not work. Again, realtors, do not get involved with this. This is outside of your scope of work. It's something that you should stay away from. Cash for keys, definitely not a DIY. Okay, so we're coming to the close to the end of the presentation. Again, I never charge for any of my giveaways. This is a free download. I'm going to send a copy of this presentation to Tina. Tina, feel free to send it off to the agents. They can look back at it for reference. You can download the guide, use it in your business. This is something that I've developed in my years of being a landlord and a legal representative. There we go. Perfect. So now we are at the end of the presentation. I'm going to open up the floor, Tina, for a Q&A.